Paulina's PhD supervisor. Today is the 16th and last appointment of the thematic seminar series as part of the NEWAVE Diffused Conference 2024, which started at the beginning of April as bi-weekly online seminars. The NEWAVE Diffused Conference showcased the research work of our early-stage researchers with the participation of several distinguished discussants and panelists on a variety of water governance topics that well represented the research spirit and ambition of our network. Today's seminar will start with Paulina Raniecka lecture titled "What We Talk About When We Talk About the Global Water Crisis: Unpacking Human Water Problems Through a Multi-Perspectivity Approach." Paulina is a PhD candidate at the Department of Environmental Policy Analysis of the Institute for Environmental Studies of the Vrije Universiteit of Amsterdam. She has a background in environment and resource management with a specialization in global water challenges from the VU. Her research interests lie at the intersection of water governance, environmental justice, and conflict studies. Prior to beginning her PhD, Paulina worked as affiliated researcher for the NEWAVE network. And alongside her doctoral research, she currently works as the communication coordinator of the Amsterdam Sustainability Institute, a VU-wide knowledge center for sustainability-related research that we have at our university. Together with Paulina, I'm very glad to welcome our invited discussant, renowned Professor Anja Nygren, Professor of Global Development Studies and founding member of the Global Extractivisms and Alternatives Research Initiative, EXALT, at the University of Helsinki in Finland. Professor Nygren is also Jan de Vos Visiting Professor at the Centro de Investigaciones y Estudios Superiores en Antropología Social and at the Colegio de la Frontera Sur in Mexico. Anja's recent research interests have focused on water governance, flood disasters, environmental justice, hydrocarbon extraction, resource frontiers, and urban disasters and displacements. She has carried out long-term empirical research in Latin America, specifically in Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Honduras, and Mexico. And currently, she's leading a research project that focuses on repair and responsibility in fragile environments with empirical case studies from Mexico, Bolivia, Chile, Indonesia, and Cambodia. I will be here to moderate the session and provide some remarks on Paulina's research and moderate the question and answers from the audience. Speaking of which, I would kindly remind you that you can submit your questions anytime during the seminar using the Q&A function that you can find in the bottom of the Zoom page. Thank you so much, and I hope you will enjoy the seminar. Paulina, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Gianfel. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you also, Caterina and Ariadna, for the technical support. I'm going to move on to the presentation. As mentioned, I will be talking about the global water crisis and specifically the different perspectives that there are to how we understand it. And this is research that is ongoing. So I will be focusing mainly on my first paper, which we have submitted with my co-authors recently. And I will bring in some preliminary findings from the second paper that I am currently working on, also co-authored with my colleagues from the NEWAVE network. And before I go into the papers and into the results, I wanted to set the scene a little bit, talk a little bit about how we can understand water and how we can understand the global water crisis, a little bit of an introduction there. So let's start with that. And when I give seminars about the introduction to water governance, I like to open the lecture with a very broad question. So I ask the students to define what water is for them. And it's a really nice exercise because you really see that there's so many different answers because there is no one correct way of answering this question. But another aspect that I really enjoy when it comes to this exercise is experiencing that perhaps the person sitting right next to you can have such a different understanding of what water is. And this is not necessarily a new thing. This is this differences in how we understand water has been recognized by critical water governance scholars. But I would argue that one of the more memorable lines come from Jamie Linton and his book on water. It's titled "What is Water? The History of Modern Abstraction." And in the very opening sentence, he states the following: "Water is what we make of it," which is definitely one of those phrases that is meant to really challenge you and make you go, what do you mean by that? And he elaborates a little bit more a couple pages later, and he brings in the following quote: "When scholars ask how are some social actors able to impose their definition of water on other social actors with different but equally legitimate definitions, it signals not only that water is becoming understood as a socially relative phenomenon, but that even something as apparently straightforward as identifying the nature of water is an intensely political act." So the few elements here that I want to point out and that really became central to my doctoral research is this idea of different but equally legitimate definitions, the recognition of water as a socially relative phenomenon, and also recognition that when it comes to defining what water is, or for example, what water governance is, recognizing that this act is actually filled with politics. It's very political. So moving on to a little bit more quotes from different authors, I want to point out that indeed the way we understand water can be so multifaceted. And the first quote is from an author from Kerehazu, from a publication in 2022, in which she states that nothing occurs in isolation but in relation. That is why you cannot just name water without considering its interaction with specific contexts. And here in this paper, she brings in an anecdote where she spoke with an Aymara woman, an indigenous woman from South America. And when she asked her to define water, she found it, you could argue, even frustrating because she couldn't figure it out. She couldn't give one answer. And after some time of thinking, she really pointed out that it depends on so many different aspects. And this is something that is also seen in a publication by Matsura Namandi and Shikora from 2023, where they state that various things and circumstances make water what it is. So we can see that our understanding of water is deeply contextualized, and it depends on many different factors. Vinciguerra also offers a little bit more guidance here, saying that it also can depend on the disciplinary background that we come from. So as stated in his paper from 24, differences between disciplines seem to explain, at least partially, while using the same concept, speakers are proposing different solutions to water challenges. This also points out the fact that we might be using the same language, but our understanding of a given word can also carry completely different meaning and therefore different consequences. So this is the one side of this multiplicity of water, but then the other side that I wanted to point out is also the fact that defining water is not a neutral activity. So that's something that was mentioned towards the end of the quote by Jamie Linton. And you see that here as well. Linton brings up Vandana Shiva and her statement that the way water is conceptualized and represented is instrumental in determining who gains access to it and on what terms. And this is also a central theme of research done by Svartevein et al. From 2017. Margriet Svartevein is actually a NEWAVE network member as well, and some other colleagues there, who also define water governance practices as thick with politics and culture. And they state that they are linked to creative processes of imagining and producing collective water futures. And they combine political problems of scale with the problems of coherence. So we're seeing that not only there's several different ways of looking at water governance, and by default looking at water crisis, this can also be later on translated in a situation where some groups are either granted access to water and others are excluded from it. And essentially some some aspects, some elements of the society have access to this new water future that is being created and others don't. So it's very important to recognize this political, the cultural political sphere of water as well. So let's try to begin to understand the global water crisis. As already mentioned, my research is ongoing, so this definitely won't be an exhaustive answer to this question. I also don't think there is one exhaustive ultimate answer to this question. So to give you a little bit of a background, what we see in the 1980s, in the early 1980s, is a shift in policy domain and also a shift in the water domain. So we move away from a hydraulic mission, this idea that we as humans need to tame unruly water resources, ideally through large-scale infrastructure like mega dams. And we move on to this recognition that we are in the times of governance of wicked water problems. So we recognize that water problems are interconnected, they're multifaceted, there's no one way of answering them. And it's also a recognition that perhaps those mainstream techniques that we've been relying on don't work anymore. And at the same time, what we're seeing is this emergence of the concept of water crisis in literature as well. It starts in around 1960s, and it really gains momentum in the 1980s, and particularly in the 1990s, where not only is it very present in scientific literature, also gray literature and the media, but it also becomes very urgent. So in the 1990s, we really see that this is something that is looming in the near future. It's really waiting around the corner for us. Another large quote, very impactful quote that has been paraphrased since then and quoted many, many times is the statement that the water crisis is largely a governance crisis. So it's not necessarily the problems themselves, but it's also the fact that we are unable to respond to them. Our ways of adjusting to those problems and solving them are not effective. Nonetheless, with all those developments, there's still a lot of ambiguity. Water crisis has been used as an umbrella term. It has been collecting a lot of different issues. And depending on the person, they might have a very different understanding of the water crisis than someone else, depending on the disciplinary background as well. So that was the idea for my doctoral research, to really try to understand what are all those different subcomponents of this very loaded term. And to do that, to get a little bit closer to this understanding, I am relying on this concept of problematiques. And I will go into detail in a second about this specific concept. But the idea is to critically examine the nature of contemporary water problems, really understand what's happening out there, essentially. Problematiques is part of the 3 pillars heuristic framework. And this is a framework developed by the NEWAVE network, through which you can approach the challenge of water governance from 3 interrelated angles. Problematiques, as mentioned, but also paradigms and patterns. So paradigms allow us to engage with the ideational underpinnings of water governance, and patterns allows us to explicitly uncover the socio-environmental impacts of various patterns and modes of governance. So let's dive a little bit deeper into problematiques. This is the specific aspect or concept rather that I've used in our first paper. And the idea, the notion of problematique that we use is built on the concept of problematique introduced in the proposal for the Club of Rome in 1970. The way we define it, problematique within the space of water challenges, is a cluster of similar types of water problems, a broader, higher level recurring issue that manifests on multiple scales in various geographical settings and persists in time. So we see that these human water problematiques are meta problems that go beyond the specific closed and clearly delineated definition of problems and can be generalized as coherent areas of research and policy intervention, even when happening on multiple spatial and governance scales. So with this in mind, let's move on to the first paper, as promised. This is a paper I co-authored with a few NEWAVE colleagues, and it recently was submitted for publishing. And this idea here is that what we're seeing is that effective water governance practices require a lot of coordination. And this is coordination between actors, sectors, and scales. And not only that, on top of this, we need agenda alignment. We need to understand what is it that needs to be done. And this is something that has been lacking or hasn't been developed to the extent that would allow us to effectively cope with the problems that we're seeing. What we're applying is a synthesizing lens to delineate some of the most pressing human water challenges. And that would lead us to set priorities and communicate the challenges of the ongoing water crisis with the society, with policymakers, with academia. And in turn, that would lead us to more guided action in the face of the water crisis. It's fundamental to be reflexive and critical about how water problems are identified, prioritized, and addressed, as these processes have political and decision-making implications. So this is, once again, coming back to the quotes that I brought up earlier on in the presentation. It's not just about recognizing, okay, this is how one group of people or perhaps one sector defines water crisis. It's also recognizing that this is a political process and that it can have really dramatic implications. So to briefly walk you through the methodology, for this paper, it was a two-step methodology. We started with a systematic literature review, and we continued with a constant comparison method. So what you see here on the left is the search string that we used. And what we wanted to do is really use a very exploratory approach. So we didn't want to indicate any kind of problem. We didn't want to set any kind of bias. So we tried to stay as objective as possible. Of course, it's not always it's never really possible to be fully objective, but we really didn't want to influence the search. So we didn't put search terms such as pollution or conflicts. We really wanted to see what comes out. This is a list that we've created together with our work group, and we shared it with the wider expert network for completion. On the right side, you see the steps of narrowing down the number of papers. So in the end, we ended up with 315 papers that were then coded for the problem, among other aspects, for the problem that they discussed. And at this stage, we were using the exact phrasing as the authors of the given paper. And it was quite a long process to get through all those papers. We did it manually with two colleagues of mine, with Camilla Govoni and Nicolas Galli, and we would meet regularly to discuss the papers that we went through and address any kind of issues that came up or any kind of conflicts that came up. The next step was constant comparison method, which is a tool for analyzing qualitative data through coding and synthesizing the available information inductively. And we had our first layer of coding done. We had a lot of different codes using the language of the authors. So what we then did is we started grouping them according to certain themes. We started seeing certain patterns. And from those patterns, we came up with certain names, if you will. And these were the subclusters that then ended up becoming a larger cluster that is the problematique. The last step here you see is the theory creation. And in our case, it was the creation of the human water taxonomy. And it's presented both visually and in the form of a water governance glossary. I will present the visualization of it. When it comes to glossary, once the paper is published, I would warmly invite you to go through it because it was based on a second round of literature search with targeted search strings for each subcomponent to really go more in depth about each of the subcomponents. So this is the results from the first paper. What you see on the left is the 9 problematiques that we identified with their subcomponents. And on the right side, you also see the geographic distribution. So we looked into the papers. Again, we coded for geographic location, and we could see whether certain problems are perhaps reserved to certain areas, or if certain problems just simply don't appear in other parts. And of course, this is not exhaustive. That also wasn't the idea with the paper. We didn't aim to create an ultimate overview, because first of all, I don't think it's necessarily possible, as all those problems keep changing water, and our understanding of it and our relationship of it is also fluid. But to also make it more manageable, we focused on 18 years of publications between 2004 and 2022. So it's only a chunk of literature, and we also narrowed it down to English language literature. So there's a lot of improvements that can be done, and this is by no means an exhaustive overview, but it definitely offers an interesting perspective and a step forward. Another thing that we looked into was this idea of interconnectedness. So this comes back to the notion of a wicked problem. These are problems that are multifaceted, problems that are very often connected to other issues, can even cause other issues. So we did this analysis to see what kind of problems were connected to what kind of challenges according to the literature that we analyzed. And very often that would be the case, that you look into a paper and you see that perhaps the focus lays on water scarcity, but linked to this is inevitably water conflicts, according to the author. So that was one aspect that we focused on. And then another aspect was this idea of going beyond tangible problems. So what we see while coding the papers is that around 2010 onwards, you started having a new type of problem, if you will. So prior to that, we saw that authors focus on very palpable issues. So for example, looking at floods or looking at water pollution with, let's say, microplastics. And then from around 2010 onwards, you see that there's a lot of problems that escape this mainstream definition. So authors started discussing issues of water justice, framing of water problems and solutions, plurality of views or lack thereof, inclusion and exclusion of marginalized voices, and challenging the dominant paradigms. So a very different class of problems altogether. As mentioned before, this attempt to capture water and fix translatable word, and by extension claiming to offer exhaustive definition of the global water crisis, is futile, as water, as well as our understanding of it and the related problems, are ever changing and ever flowing. This is very much at the basis of our paper as well. And while working on it, we were happy to put the building block and, make a step forward. But we knew that there's so much more out there, and so many different perspectives to include. And this, I think, is a relatively nice segue for the second paper that I'm currently working on. And this is also a paper co-authored with a few of my NEWAVE colleagues. And this paper took a different approach to analyzing the existing human water problems. Essentially, the idea was to offer a more inclusive analysis and to look into people and organizations working with water. So instead of looking solely at scientific literature, what we wanted to do is to investigate how water actors define and characterize water problematics themselves, rather than through the lens of academic literature. And in this case, the methodological strategy consists of two steps. And the first step is actors identification. And these are actors that are expected to have some kind of an influence, presence. I'll get into that in a second. The second phase is the analysis of perspective. So content analysis of reports produced by the given actors. And what we wanted to do was also include a temporal analysis. So we looked at reports in two different periods of time, around the year 2000 and around the year 2020, to see not only what kind of problems appear, but also whether a given actor shifts their focus or shifts their approach to a given problem. To select the actors, The database was created based on the knowledge of the group and experiences of the group, but then it was completed by an expert feedback session with the wider NEWAVE network. And once we had that list of actors, we had to figure out how to select actors to actually look into, because obviously there's a lot of different stakeholders within the policy arena, within the water arena as well. So what we conducted was a multi-criteria decision-making analysis to filter those actors. And the different elements we looked into was the scale, duration of engagement, diversity of domains of action, partnerships, budget, and online presence. And afterwards, an elimination and choice expressing reality method was used. And there was a set of possible attributes that each criterion could have prepared. And also each attribute was assigned a specific weight. And to order the actors, an analysis in R was done. This is a process that was conducted by a colleague of mine, Paula Andrea Zuluaga Guerra. And you can see, just to give you a little bit of an idea here, on the right side in the table, you can have a look, for example, on the scale of action, which refers to the geographical scale in which the actor implements actions. You can see that there are several attributes. So perhaps the scale of action is local, perhaps they operate on a regional scale or at the global scale, and there's a different value assigned. Through this process, we arrived at the following table. And these are the organizations that we actually analyzed, whose reports we actually analyzed. And we have environmental NGOs, intergovernmental organizations, international financial organizations, national development organizations, river basin, sectoral, social organizations, and think tanks. So quite a fine diversity. And we try to look into comparable documents. So normally an annual report from the two temporal phases, if you will. To give you a little bit of an idea of the results, I'm going to offer, these are preliminary findings, but the overview of the problematics identified so far. And what you see putting them together, there's quite a bit of an overlap, which is really exciting to see. It's also quite curious. However, there's definitely a different level of specificity. And it also makes sense knowing that water actors tend to work on very specific issues. So some of the level of detail is much higher on the right-hand side on the results from the actors paper. But as mentioned, this is ongoing, so I'm excited to see how this develops and do a proper analysis between the two. So this is what I have for now. Thank you so much for listening, and I'm hoping to keep this doctoral process going and keep awarding this multiplicity of perspectives and allow for the acknowledgement of plurality of worldviews. And what I learned in my time at NEWAVE was definitely the fact that reflexivity is such a crucial step in the search for a way forward. So I hope to implement that in my next steps, and hoping to put the next building block and get one step closer, slowly but surely at a time. Thank you so much, and I will pass it on to Jean-Paul.
Thanks a lot, Paulina. I think I'm very biased because I of course, like very much your research approach, and I'm fully supportive. But I think you are also the right person to conduct this type of synthetic efforts, because I think what you're really doing very well is trying to take advantage of the power of synthesis and meta-analytical techniques, which are being conducted in a very rigorous way. But at the same time, you're constantly rethinking and being reflective about the processes. So I think that this is where good methodological approaches, rather than being discarded for a certain type of epistemological positioning, they are actually being improved. And I think that there is a lot of good knowledge generation dialogue that is coming out of your work. But apart from this, I do have a question before I will pass it to our dear discussant, and it doesn't really relate to the specifics of the two papers that you are presenting. It relates more to one of the introductory comments that you made, and it's this idea that really I really got. It was quite striking when you referred to the idea that there are some water futures that are in constant generation, and very often the question is who actually has even the possibility about being involved in the definition of water futures. And so if you go back to the quote of water is what we make out of it, I think that it's what is really perhaps where I would like you to elaborate a little bit more, because I think you have some interesting perspectives there, is the fact that it's not only about the current situation of the global water crisis. It's not only about disproportional benefits and disproportional costs and dynamics of access that relate to the different type of problematics that you are describing, but it's also about the future. And so how do we deal with the issue of designing futures, water futures, and justice? What is your take there?
Thank you so much. What a question. What an opening question. I would really have to reflect on this to give you a proper answer, but I think there's two elements that I want to point out. One of them is definitely the reflection on who is it that can participate in this process. Do we have the architecture that allows us to participate, for example, us as citizens? Do we have those spaces in which we can discuss potential futures, contribute to this potential future? And the answer, sadly, is not always yes. And the creation of such spaces also take time. I think a lot of people are excited about having those spaces, but don't realize how difficult it is to create them. So that's something that I wanted to address, and I hope to contribute to the creation of spaces like this and to the creation of potential many futures, many realities. But how to get there, that's a whole different question. Then the second point I wanted to mention is this idea of dominant discourses, and that's something that I think many of us are very familiar with. Some of us, I can imagine, also follow a lot of the developments on the water arena. So, for example, what's happening now post the UN Water Conference that took place in 2023, we do see that there is a certain dominant way of thinking. And I think that is a very tricky space and risky situation to find ourselves in, where even if you want to contribute to the creation of alternative worldviews, the alternative futures, you might be faced with a very strong narrative that doesn't even allow you to move beyond it. So I think a lot of people don't even question when they hear that water is an economic resource. Water is something that we should use, make money off, price, but not for the reason that we value it, but price for the purpose of making money of it. I think that a lot of people don't even question it, don't even allow for this multiplicity. And I think that's very difficult. And, once again, a different question on how we ensure that those spaces for critical reflections are there. But it's definitely something that I consider crucial and I want to contribute to allow people to take a step back and realize, okay, perhaps this is just one perspective and not the only perspective that's out there.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think actually with your research work, that is exactly what you're doing. I think that in order to overcome the dominant narratives, it is actually important to be analytical about what, and we are starting, you're starting this process specifically looking at the scientific production. But I think that it's this analytical approach, this analytical lens that is actually the one that is necessary to debunk and to unmask certain narratives and certain dominant narratives that then of course are there because they do have a purpose. And I think that the issue of participation is actually very important. We know that participation is very often co-opted or manipulated. I think something that we experienced at the UN Water Conference was this aspect of tokenism and bringing in representatives of different types of groups just to kind of reinforce a certain type of prevailing agendas and narratives. But yes, I think that surely you're fully fulfilling your role as a researcher to to work on these issues in an analytical way. Said this, I would like to invite Professor Anja Nygren to join us, and I think she has prepared some comments for your presentation.
Yes, many thanks, Paulina and Jambel. I thank for being invited to this NEWAVE conference. And I really enjoyed reading your paper and listening to your presentation. My comments relate especially to your first paper. I consider your paper as highly important and relevant. It provides a very valuable and even unique meta-analysis of issues relevant for current global water crisis. It is based on systematic literature review. You analyzed carefully 315 scientific articles on governance of human water problems. And your evaluation focused on highly relevant research questions, including what are the most pressing contemporary water problematics according to current water governance scholarship, how these problems are addressed by different scholars, and how the identification of these problems shapes the management of water problems. What I was really impressed was that each of the articles were reviewed and carefully coded by several researchers in your team, which, in my view, considerably improved the reliability of your results. Your evaluation, both in your paper and in your presentation, it clearly showed that the water issues are big problems with multiple actors, drivers, and scales. Your analysis, in my view, makes a significant contribution to water governance literature by carefully showing multiple interconnections and overlappings between different human water problems. I have myself realized the same complexity when studying, for example, flood disasters in urban areas in Mexico and hybrid forms of water governance on different wetlands. So, as you convincingly show, it is fairly difficult to separate, for example, the questions of water distribution from those of water infrastructure, taking into account that irrigation for agricultural purposes is the main driver of groundwater exploitation. My own research also indicates that it is hard to separate flood issues from questions of collaborative governance. Taking into account that the history of flood management in many countries shows that it is not possible to prevent flood disasters just through technical flood prevention. But we also need softer forms of governance which aim at increasing the resilience of vulnerable populations. In this respect, your analysis of water, energy, food nexus is highly innovative. It shows the multiple overlappings, interconnections, and co-occurrences of different water-related activities, such as agriculture, hydropower generation, and wastewater treatment. What I also consider highly important in your analysis is that you clearly indicate that human water problems do not just originate from the diversity of different perceptions, or because the existing scientific knowledge is not being applied. Rather, we also need to pay attention to different kinds of interests and power relations involved in multi-scalar water policies. So the questions of whose needs, whose values, whose interests, and whose agendas count are highly relevant. Your analysis makes an important contribution to water governance literature in clearly showing how the questions of resource distribution, cultural recognition, and political representation are tightly interwoven in the global water crisis and associated issues of water justice. Overall, your study contributes significantly for amplifying the evaluation of global water crisis toward more integrated analysis of human water interactions and toward multifaceted interactions of material and symbolic or cultural issues related to water governance. This including the recent approaches related to hydrosocial issues, socio-natures, hydropolitics, and contested waterscapes. Congratulations for excellent analysis and for highly inspiring paper. I would also like to just briefly raise some questions or comments related to your interesting paper. The first question or comment is, could you please tell us a little bit more about the theory creation that this sort of data analysis allowed you to do? You briefly mentioned it in your paper, but could you please elaborate your ideas in this respect a little bit more? Second, your presentation of the geographical overview of cases analyzed is highly impressive and very relevant. It is interesting to see their geographical distribution. It seems to me that countries that are most prominent are those that are populous, geopolitically powerful countries, such as the USA, China, Brazil, India, Australia, and to a certain extent, Russia. So I'm curious, what do you think these results probably tell us about the importance of water problematics in these countries? But I'm wondering if these results also reflect the relative power of the researchers studying these countries to get their research funded and their analysis published. Third, I have some comments related to the selection of the keywords. I know that the selection of relevant keywords for a systematic literature review is always highly challenging, and there is no simple recipe how to make good choices. As far as I know, you use 3 major keywords: water, governance, and problem, with their different variations. So in the case of water, you used a variety of related terms such as basin, watershed, catchment, and wetland, which sounds very convincing. Concerning the keyword global, you clearly define that global human water problematics are meta problems that go beyond the specific case studies. I highly appreciate your attention to such kind of global problems. However, still, there is a need to understand water problems in their specific context and to get detailed understanding of how the political and ecological and the social and hydrological are interlinked in contextually varied water problems. in this respect, you laudably recognize that there are no one-size-fits-all remedies. So I would like to have you reflect a little bit how easy it was to decide that you use this keyword. And then the keyword of problem. I wonder if this term problem is more used in the so-called environmental studies literature. As in most of the environmental social science studies, and especially in the literature that focuses on the global south, the term problem is nowadays fairly scantily used. As many scholars have shown, we tend to define the global south through various sorts of problems, such as desertification, deforestation, water scarcity, and water pollution, without paying sufficient attention to the questions of whose problems, whose values, whose visions, and whose solutions. So what is your reflection related to this keyword? Or did you consider any other alternative terms? Related to this, I consider it highly valuable that in your analysis, you also reflect what the future research needs of water governing might be, and how to take better into account the possible biases in our research. And also, I highly appreciate that you also reflect how to better incorporate alternative approaches and perspectives, especially from the global south. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Anya. I really appreciate all the feedback and all the critical questions. I think it's great to have this moment of reflection and to be a little bit challenged as well. I was very lucky to have a very good critical team where we could have those discussions as well and find a good way forward. But it's never too little questions like this. So I really appreciate it. We briefly spoke prior to the meeting, and you said, okay, I have a few comments, a few questions, perhaps not enough time to answer all of them. And looking at time, perhaps I'm going to give more of a general comment. So one thing that you mentioned was the geographic overview. And I also found that process quite nice to prepare, you know, the visualization of where are the different problems that we talk about, where are the different problematics, where do we see them. But I also recognize that this process was a little bit tricky, and it can also be very misleading if someone just sees this paper without the wider context. Sorry, just see this figure without the wider context. Because it's very important to know that for the background, we looked into 18 years of publications. We looked at publications in English language. So there's already certain limitations there. And what I wanted to mention is definitely this power component. So this is something that you also touched upon, and you were wondering yourself, perhaps, you know, it's a matter of getting certain grants and choosing what kind of focus you want to have. And this is something that I also was reflecting on when looking at the overview and seeing indeed that, for example, the US and China are dominant in when it comes to the problematics. They would be, I think, perhaps in every single one or almost every single one of them. And it also made me question, is it really the case that these problems are most prominent there? Or is it rather the matter that these scholars get access to more grants or more research opportunities and they choose to focus on this area? Or perhaps a certain country that is becoming a typical, so to say, fieldwork destination, because perhaps there are some countries that it's just common to do fieldwork in, and it doesn't mean that they have a substantially larger proportion of a given problem that they deal with. It's rather the fact that they just keep being selected as a case study. So it's a good figure, I would say, but at the same time, you do need to have this wider context there. And I think perhaps building on this, this idea of bias, this idea of, having the wider context, this was also relevant in other cases as well. So when coming up with the search string, for example, the first attempt we did, we had synonyms for each of the components. And then we received, I think, over 47,000 sources, and we realized, okay, this is not the best way to go. We want to be ambitious, but this is overly ambitious. So then we started narrowing it down, and we realized that the component that we are most interested in is the diversity of water, hence the focus on water, and that still yielded over 3,500 sources or so. So it was quite a lengthy process to go through all those papers also manually. And I think what was a little bit helpful is the fact that we used Scopus and we looked for the specific keywords in title, but also the abstract and the keywords. So we didn't narrow it down completely. So we managed to get also slightly more critical papers. But of course, we also had this reflection as a team that we are coming from a very specific perspective. We're all European, I believe. We're all European. Most of us are from Western Europe. I myself am from Eastern Europe. Perhaps a slight difference there, but we're still talking a relatively monocultural approach. And the bias of just relying on English language sources. So this is something indeed that we mentioned in the paper, we address it, that there is a Western perspective bias because we looked predominantly into Western publications. So this is something that we definitely want to address in the future. And I think it was a great first step also to get a bit of an understanding of the scholarship, understand what's happening in the water governance scholarship and what kind of developments you see, and also start noticing certain gaps and perhaps certain dominance of maybe a specific case study or maybe specific approach. So it was definitely a learning process, and I think a great introduction to the next steps of this journey. Thank you.
Thank you. I know that it's very challenging always to select the keywords, and I'm sure you have gone through various discussions if selecting this or that, and so I'm sure it has been clearly reflected. But it was interesting
Yes.
to feel to think a little bit about it.
Thank you very much, Anya, and thank you, Paulina. I would like to open it up to our participants, so you are very invited to submit any comments or questions in the chat. And so far, we have a question by an anonymous participant that is asking, you can read it in the chat, Paulina, but is asking, do you have some ideas, insights on the possible causes of the shift in literature from 2010 going beyond tangible problems?
That's a really good question, actually. When I first saw it, I was just, taking it all in. You just see it in a graph, what kind of terms kind of start appearing on what time. So I didn't necessarily have this moment of, wonder why. I think there could be several different reasons for it. One of them is, for example, 2010 is the year that water was recognized as a human right. It could be linked to, a bit of this transformative moment, but perhaps it's just the right timing, right place, that there's more critical scholars getting trained, that the conversation is just being opened up, hence more publications. I can think of a few names that definitely contributed to the development of this field that have been publishing in the 2010s onwards, and some of them still currently now. But that's a very, very good question, whether there's a specific indicator. I think it's always a little bit tricky to put your finger on it. But I actually genuinely don't know. I don't know if maybe Jean-Paul and Anya, if you have some expert insights into that, or whether it was just a combination of a lot of factors as normally is.
Anya, what do you think? Any intuition?
I think it's not only related to water issues, it's also in other fields of environmental questions, so that and also the discussion how tangible and intangible aspects, how they relate with each other. So there are quite wide theoretical discussions related to that, and many water governance scholars have really contributed to this discussion, and also made certain kind of novel insights into that. So I think that's really important question and comment which we need to take into account.
Thanks. I find your answer very convincing, Anya, so I don't have much to add to it. Just looking at the clock, if there are any other last comments or last questions, we can definitely take one more, which is being asked by oh my God, I'm gonna try to not butcher the pronunciation of your name, Piae Pio Kia, who's asking, how do you define global in global water crisis in your papers? Have you reflected on who represent the global in water crisis discourses? I think this is an excellent question, and Paulina, we can address it.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So, I mean, as mentioned, we wanted to do a paper in which we were very open with our geographic location, so to say. So we really, when we got together with our working group, we really said, let's see what's out there. And what you also see is a lack of this kind of an analysis because the scale is so large. So in that sense, we figure, okay, let's just look into all the literature we find within those nearly 20 years. Having said that, as already mentioned, we looked specifically into literature from the global north, literature that, well, maybe not entirely from global north, but predominantly from the global north, as we focus on English language publications. There were a few publications coming from other institutes, but it really depended whether they're in English or not, whether they would pop up in the literature review process. So having said that, the global representative is global when it comes to the case studies done and coded by us, because we did see that those papers really had a global reach. But when it comes to the diversity of perspectives, it's definitely not exhaustively global. It's definitely a big space for improvement there, and inclusion of different kind of sources, different language sources. Yeah, so I would say we defined it by geographic scope, but we also have the reflection of this is a Western biased analysis in that sense.
Thank you. And I think that this is a really good segue to another question that is being asked by Clara Luxardo. And she's asking, thank you, Paulina, for the clear presentation, discussing your interesting research. You have touched upon reflexivity as being a salient feature of your work. My question for you is, how did you thoroughly pursue reflexivity, particularly when dealing with systematic analyses?
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, really good question. So just as a bit of a step back, I became familiar with the term altogether through my work with NEWAVE and my collaboration with the early stage researchers from the NEWAVE project, to which I'm really grateful for, because they definitely pushed my understanding of water governance and also my approach to it. And one thing that I wanted to incorporate in the work is this ability to take a step back and just critically reflect and ask myself, okay, in the wider context, how can I understand this given term or this kind of pattern I'm seeing? And what I really appreciated is that I had a great team working on this paper together with me, and despite working in COVID times, for most of the time, we would have a really good schedule in which we would connect and discuss. And it wouldn't be just a check-in. It would really be a lot of critical contributions. And when it comes to the systematic literature review, on that process, I worked specifically with two other colleagues from Polimi, Camilla Govoni and Nicolas Gali. And with them, we had also like a side group, so to say. So we would really go deep. We would discuss our differences when it comes to coding, and we would highlight any issues we would have, and we would just discuss in person. So that's definitely one way of doing it, and then reporting back to the plenary, to the wider group that we worked with, and getting more feedback from that group as well. So that's one thing. And another thing is that just more on the personal level, I think just trying to challenge myself and to search for literature that also challenges my perspective, and realizing that what I've been taught as, let's say the water cycle, this is the Western water cycle, even adding those kind of small moments of, oh, okay, this is not the one universal, way that the world is, has really helped me in reading new papers now and really engaging and thinking, okay, where is this person, for example, based in? What kind of university they work with or institute they work with? Where is it located? Yeah, even looking at gender in some cases, depending on the analysis. So I'm trying to really look at the different components and see how that might change the way that water or a given problem was shaped in.
Okay. If there are any further last questions, this is the moment. Let's see. Otherwise, I think this is a perfect time to end our presentation.
There are some questions in the chat, Gianpel, not in the Q&A box, but in the chat.
Okay, let me double check what I missed. I think we addressed all of them. Or Caterina, do you see any question that I missed?
One that it was just posted by. By Arianna.
Yeah, I put it from the discussion group, so everyone.
Okay, yeah, because it was coming now, so I was thinking it was an additional one from your side, but I see it's the same. Yes, okay.
Okay, so I think we addressed all the questions, right? If I'm correct. Yeah, great. Okay, well, thank you so much. Thank you, Paulina. Thank you so much, Anya. We really appreciated your time, and not only you engaged with this webinar. You also provided thorough comments to the paper itself. That is really helpful in actually the development of this work. And I think that now it's actually the time to wrap up our webinar series, the NEWAVE Diffused conference. And I really want to thank especially Caterina Marinetti and Ariadna, Thomas, who really supported our work, and sorry, Ariadna Romans, who really supported our work and made all of this possible. There's been a lot of communication efforts and organizational efforts to get this diffused online conference function as well as it did. And all of the webinars have been recorded online, so they will be available on our NEWAVE YouTube channel. But please stay in touch and stay connected. If you are not registered to our newsletter, that is where we promote our events, and we are looking forward to new activities and new events and new opportunities from the NEWAVE network in 2025. So for 2024, this was our last initiative. And now I would like to pass it to Caterina for her closing remarks, and I think she has more of our organizational partners to thank. So thank you, everyone. Thank you to all the participants. And Caterina, please wrap up our initiative.
Thank you so much, Jean-Paul. And I would like to start just by echoing your appreciations for today's seminar. So thank you, Anya, thank you, Paulina, and Arianna as well. It was a very interesting seminar, and I'm putting here the list of the 16 seminars we had during this year. I have to say that it has been a truly enriching experience to listen to them all, attending, and also a vast engagement from the audience made it even more interesting and very interactive. So thank you once again to our wonderful audience for having joined us. And as you said, Jean-Paul, all the, let me just change, I think it stopped. Yeah, all the recordings are available on our YouTube channel. And yes, I would like to thank our host institutions and partner organizations of NEWAVE for the wonderful collaboration that they have given to us. And of course, to thank all of you once again and invite, as Jean-Paul did, to follow us through our channels for more updates in 2025. Thank you so much once again. And with this, I believe we close this seminar series, and we look forward to meeting you again next year. Thank you.